Hello, and welcome back, my fellow Lovecraftians. Today, we'll be reading a truly terrifying, spine chilling tale called The Transition of Juan Romero. Of the events which took place at the Norton Mine on October 18th and 19th of 1894, I have no desire to speak. A sense of duty to science is all that impels me to recall. In these last years of my life, scenes happening fraught with a terror doubly acute because I cannot wholly define it. But I believe that before I die, I should tell you what I know of the, shall I say, transition of Juan Romero. My name and origin need not to be related to posterity. In fact, I fancy it is better that they should not be, for when a man suddenly migrates to the state or the colonies, he leaves his past behind him. Besides, what I once was is not in the least relevant to my narrative, save perhaps the fact that during my service in Indiana, I was more at home amongst white bearded native teachers than amongst my brother officers. I had delved not a little into odd Eastern lore when overtaken by calamities which brought about my new life in America's vast West, a life wherein I found it well to accept a name, my present one, which is very common and carries no meaning. In the summer and autumn of 1894, I dwelt in the drear expanses of the Cactus Mountains, employed as a common laborer at the celebrated Norton mine, whose discovery by an aged prospector, some years before he had turned the surrounding region from a nearly unpeopled waste to a seething cauldron of sordid life, a cavern of gold, lying deep below a mountain lake, had enriched its veritable finder beyond his wildest dreams, and now formed the seat of an extensive tunnel operation on the path of the corporation to which it had finally been sold. Additional grottos had been found, and the yellow material was exceedingly great, so that a mighty and harnigerous army of miners toiled day and night in the numerous passage and rock hollows. The superintendent and Mr. Arthur often discussed the singularity of the local geologist formations, speculating on the probable extent of the chain of caves, and estimated the future of the titanic mining enterprise. He considered the obtuse cavities the result of an action of water, and believed the last of them would soon be opened. It was not long after my arrival in employment that Juan Romero came to the Norton mine, one of a large herd of unkempt Mexicans attracted thither from the neighboring country. He at first commanded attention only because of his features, which, though plainly of the Indian type, were yet remarkable for their light color and refined conformation, being vastly unlike those of the average greaser or Paiute of the locality. It is curious that although he differed so widely from the mass of Hispanics and tribal Indians, Romano gave not at least the impression of Caucasian blood. It was not the Castilian conquistadors of the American pioneer, but the ancient and noble Aztec, whose imagination called to view when the silent Peruvian would rise in the early morning and gaze in fascination at the sun as it crept above the eastern hills, meanwhile stretching out his arms to the orb as if performance of some rite whose nature he did not himself comprehend. But save for his face, Romero was not any way suggestively of nobility. Ignorant and filthy, he was at home amongst the other people working in the mines. Having come so, I was afterwards told, from the likely lowest sort of surroundings, he had been found as a child in the crude mountain hut, and only survivor of an epidemic which had stalked lethally by. Near the hut, close to a rather unusual rock fissure, had lain two skeletons, newly picked by vultures, and presumably forming the sole remains of his parents. No one recalled their identity, and they were soon forgotten by many. Indeed, the crumbling of the adobe hut and the closing of the rock fissure by a subsequent avalanche had helped to efface even the scenes of recreation reared by a Mexican cattle thief who had given his name Juan. Differed little from his fellows. The attachment which Romero manifested towards me when undoubtedly commenced through the quaint and ancient Hindu ring which I wore, not engaged in active labor or of its nature. The manner of coming into my possession I cannot speak. It was my last link with a chapter of my life forever closed, and I valued it highly. Soon I observed that the odd-looking person was likewise interested, eyeing it with expressions that banished all suspicion of mere contevadness. It Jorge hieroglyphs seemed to stir some faint recollection in the untutored but active mind, though he could not possibly have beheld their like before. Within a few weeks after his advent, Romero was like a faithful servant to me. This notwithstanding the fact that I myself, but an ordinary miner, our conversations was necessarily limited. He knew but a few words of English, while I found my oxygen Spanish was something quite different from the patos of peon of New Spain. The event which I am about to relate was unheralded by my long premonitions, though the man Romero had interest in me, and though my ring had affected him peculiarly. I think that neither of us had any expectation of what to follow when the great blast was set off. Geological considerations had dictated an extension of the mine directly downward from the deepest part of the subterranean area, and the belief of the superintendent that only solid rock would be encountered had led to the placing of the prodigious charge of dynamite. With this work Romero and I were not connected, wherefore our first knowledge of extraordinary conditions came from others. The charge, heavier perhaps had been estimated, had seemed to shake the entire mountains. Windows and shanties of the slope outside were shattered by the shock, whilst miners throughout the nearest passage were knocked from their feet. Jewel Lake, which lay above the scene of action, heaved as its tempest. Upon investigations, it was seen that a new abyss yawned indefinitely below the seat of the blast, an abyss so monstrous that no handling line might fathom it, nor any lamp illuminate it. Baffled, the excavators thought a conference with the superintendent, who ordered great lengths of rope to be taken to the pit, and spliced and lowered without cessation till the bottom might be discovered. Shortly afterwards, the pale-faced workmen apprised the superintendent of their failure. Firmly, though respectfully, they signed their refusal to revisit the chasm, or indeed to work further in the mine, until it might be sealed. Something beyond their experience was evidently confronting them, for so far as they could ascertain, the void below them was infinite. The superintendent did not reapproach them. Instead, he pondered deeply, and made many plans for the following days. The night shift did not go on that evening. At 2 in the morning, a lone coyote on the mountain began to howl dismally. From somewhere within the works, a dog barked in answer, either to the coyote or to something else. A storm was gathering around the peaks of the range, and wearily shaped clouds scurried horribly across the blurred patch of the celestial light which marked a gibbous moon's attempt to shine through many layers of circumstatus vapors. And the Romero's voice coming from the bank above that awakened me, a voice excited and tense with some day expectation I could understand. Madre de Dios, el sombra es el sombrero udgirviad. Lo oidviad? Senor, that sound! I listened, wondering what he meant. The coyote, the dog, the storm, all were audible, the last named now gaining ancestry as the wind shrieked more and more frantically. Flashes of lightning were visible throughout the bunkhouse window. I questioned the nervous Juan Romero, repeating the sounds I had heard. El coyote, el perro, el viento. But Romero did not reply. Then he commenced whispering in awe. El elemento, señor, el elemento de la tierra, that throbbed down on the ground. And now I also heard it, heard and shivered, and without knowing why, deep, deep below me was a sound, a rhythm, just as the peon had said, which though exceedingly faint, yet dominant, even the dog, the coyote, and the increasing tempest to seek to describe were useless, for it was such that no description is possible. Perhaps it was like the pulsing of an engine, far down in a great liner, as sensed from the deck, yet it was not so mechanical, not so devoid of the element of life and consciousness. Of all its qualities, remoteness and the earth most impressed to me. To my mind rushed fragments of a passage in Jos Galvao, where Poe had quoted with tremendous effect. The vastness, profoundly and unsearchable of its works which had a depth infinitely greater than the well of Democritus. Suddenly, Romero leapt from his bed, pausing before me to gaze at the strange ring on my hand, which glistened queerly in every flash of lightning, and then staring intently in the direction of the mine shaft. I also rose, and both stood motionless for a time, straining our ears, and that uncanny rhythm seemed more and more to take on a vital quality. Then, without apparent palpitation, we began to move towards the door, whose rattlings in the gangle had a comforting suggestion of earthly reality. The chanting in the depths for such sound now seemed to be growing in volume and distinctness, and we felt the irresistible urge out into the storm. And there, in the gaping blackness of the shaft, we encountered no living creature, for the men of the night shift had been released from their duty, and were doubtless at the dry gulch settlement pouring sinister rumors into the ear of some drowsy bartender. From the watchman's cabins, however, gleamed a small square of yellow light, like a guardian's eye. I dimly wandered in. How rhythmic the sound had affected the watchman, but Romero was moving more swiftly now, and I followed without pausing. As we followed without pausing and we descended into the shaft, the sound beneath grew definitely composite. It struck me as horrible, like a sound of oriental ceremonies, with beating of drums and chanting of many voices. I have, as you were aware, been much in India. Romero and I moved, without material hesitancy, throughout the drifts and down ladders, ever towards the thing that allured us, yet even with a pitifully helpless fear and reluctantness. At one time I fancied I had gone mad. This was when, on wondering how our way was lightened in the absence of a lamp or a candle, I realized that the ancient ring on my finger was glowing with an eerie radiance, diffusing a pallid luster throughout the damp and heavy air around. It was without warning that Romero, after clambering down one of the many rude ladders, broke into a run and left me alone. Some new and wild note in the drumming and chanting, perceptibly but slightly to me, had acted on him in startling fashion, and with a wildly outcry he forged on ahead, unguided, in the cavern's gloom. I heard his repeated shrieks before me as he stumbled awkwardly around the level places and scrambled madly down the rickety ladders, and frightened as I was, I yet retained enough of perception to note that his speech, when articulate, was not of any sort known to me. Harsh but impressive polysyllables were replaced the customary mixture of Spanish and Wharf's English of those only oft to repeat by seemed to be least familiar to me. Later, I definitely placed that word in the works of a great historian, and shuddered when the associate came to me. The climax of that awful night was composed but barely brief, beginning just as I reached the final cavern of the journey. Out of the darkness immediately ahead burst a final shriek from Juan Romero, which was joined by a chorus of uncouth sound. I reached the final cavern. In that moment, it seemed as if all the hidden towers and monstrosities of earth had become articulate in an effort to overwhelm the human race. Simultaneously, the light from my ring was extinguished, and I saw a new light glimmering from a lower space. But a few yards ahead of me, I had arrived at the abyss, which was now redly aglow, and which had evidently swallowed up the unfortunate Romero. Advancing, I peered over the edge of the chasm which no line could fathom. It was now in pandemonium, a flickering flame and hideous uproar. At first I held nothing but a seething blur of luminosity, and then the shapes, all infinitely distant, began to detach themselves from the confusion. I saw... was it Juan Romero? But God, I dare not tell you what I saw. Some power from heaven coming to my aid obliterated both sights and sounds in such a crash as it may be heard from two universes collided in space. Chaos supervented, and I knew the peace to oblivion. I hardly known how to continue, since conditions so singularly are unavoidable. But I will do my best, not even trying to differentiate betwixt the real and apparent. When I, awkward as I was safe in my bunk, and the red glow of dawn was visible at the window, some distance away, the lifeless body of Juan Romero lay upon a table, surrounded by a group of men, including the camp's doctor and the men that were discussing the strange death of Juan Romero as he lay asleep. A death seeming connected in some way with a terrible bolt of lightning which had struck and shaken the mountain. No direct cause was evident, and an autopsy failed to shew any reason why Romero would not be living. Snatches of conversation indicate beyond a doubt that neither Romero nor I had left the bunkhouse during the night. Neither had been awake during the day, and the frightful storm which had passed over the cactus range, that storm, said men who had ventured down the mine shaft, caused extensive caving in. Oh, Juan Romero. When the watchman sounded he had heard prior to the night thunderbolt, he mentioned a coyote, a dog, and snarling mountains wind, nothing more. Nor do I doubt his word. Upon the resumption of work, Superintendent Arthur called on some especially dependable men to make a few investigations around the spot where the gulf had appeared. Though hardly eager, they obeyed, and a deep boring was made. Results were very curious. The roof of the void, as seen whilst it was open, was not by any means thick yet now. Drills of investigations met with what appeared to be limitless extent of solid rock, finding nothing else, not even gold. The superintendent abandoned his attempts, but a perplexed look occasionally steals over his countenance as he sits thinking at his desk. One other thing is curious. Shortly after walking, on that morning after the storm, I noticed the unaccountable absence of my Hindo ring from my finger. I had prized it greatly, yet nevertheless felt a sensation of release of its disappearance. If one of my fellow miners appropriated it, he must have been quite clever of disposing of his booty, for despite advisements, a police search for the ring was never seen again. Somehow, I doubt it was stolen by mortal hands, for many strange things were taught to me in India. My options of my whole experience varies from time to time in broad daylight, and at most seasons I am apt to think the greater part of men dream, but sometimes in the autumn, about 2 in the morning, when winds and animals howl dismally, there comes from inconceivable depths below a damnable suggestion of rhythmic throbbing, and I feel that the transition of Juan Romero was terrible indeed. Such concludes the story of the transformation of Juan Romero. This tale truly is terrifying. It encaptures death, betrayal, friendships, and hell itself. Be sure to leave your thoughts, comments, and theories of what happened to Juan Romero. Until next time, my Lovecraftians, bye-bye.